Here we are at Liverpool John Moores University, and I'm delighted to welcome Trevor Mutton, who is Associate Professor in the Department for Education at the University of Oxford, and he has a specialism in teacher education. I am Gillian Peiser. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Initial Teacher Education at Liverpool John Moores University, and also the Deputy Director of CERES. So a very warm welcome to you, Trevor, and thank you for coming. So I thought maybe we'd start off. I haven't said actually what we're going to talk about. What we're going to discuss in this podcast is research-informed teacher education and various things to do with that.
Yes.
I thought it would be nice and helpful to first of all find out a little bit about you, Trevor, how you started in teacher education and what your research expertise and current interests are.
Okay, thank you. So I began my career as a secondary school teacher of modern languages, and I taught in one of our partnership schools for a number of years. And then in 1997, an opportunity became available at the Department of Education in Oxford, and I moved into teacher education initially as a modern languages curriculum tutor, subject tutor, on our PGCE programme. And then, as the years have gone on, I've taken on various responsibilities. I've been the PGCE course director from 2009 to 2017. Then I was director of what we call our professional programmes, which meant a strategic overview of the PGCE and all our part-time masters. And then from 2020 until just recently, I've been director of graduate studies, which means I've had the overview of all our academic programmes.
So that's quite some time in
Yes.
teacher education. Okay.
Yes.
And how would you explain the trajectory of your research interests?
Okay, I think I was very lucky initially in that I was invited to be part of the Developing Expertise of Beginning Teachers project, the DET project, that was co-led by Donald McIntyre from the University of Cambridge and Hazel Hagger from the University of Oxford. And I became involved in that project, was involved in some of the data collection and analysis, and then eventually was involved in some of the writing of some of the papers and the conference presentations. So from that project, I developed a real interest in beginning teachers' learning. I also have an interest in teacher education partnerships. I think the two are very closely related. And the nature of not just in terms of the structural makeup of partnerships, but the sort of pedagogical aspect of partnerships, particularly the integration of, I suppose, theory and practice within teacher education programs, but the way that the university and schools collaborate and work together within one program. So I've done quite a bit of work on teacher education partnerships, and from that an interest in research-informed clinical practice, which is broadly within the same area, and the notion of practical theorising, one of Donald McIntyre's key ideas. And then more recently, research into teacher education policy, because as you're well aware, the policy landscape has been quite challenging for teacher education, particularly over the last decade or so. So looking at some of those sort of underpinning issues in relation to policy. And I suppose finally, I still do a little bit of research in relation to modern languages, teaching modern languages pedagogy, but not so much of that generally now.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. What would you say have been some of the most interesting things that you found out about working in partnership with schools from your research, and how universities and schools work together to prepare teachers?
Okay, I think one of the things is that there is a common goal, that we share common aspirations and common goals. It's not always easy in the busy life of schools to prioritise teacher education, because the primary purpose of schools is for the education of their own pupils and students. But I think it is the commitment of schools is there. And what's interesting, I think it's that if the ideas are strong, then it's not easy, but it's easier to engage with school partners and for that to develop as a collaborative partnership, not a university-directed partnership or even a complementary partnership where the university does some things, the schools do others, and nominally they're the same program, but they're operating almost quite separately. So I suppose it is the nature of the richness of the partnership and an understanding of the way in which it can be genuinely collaborative, as long as you make those spaces for collaboration. If they're not there, you can't expect there to be collaborative working.
So that's really interesting, thinking about the spaces for collaboration, and I guess you've got to make those happen as well. So most people know, or a lot of people in teacher education know, that Oxford has this history of the Oxford Internship Scheme, that's what it's called. Would you say, I mean, it'd be lovely to hear a little bit more about that and its origins, but would you say that's something that's created those spaces, or are there other things that you think, you refer to strong ideas as well? Are there other dimensions or aspects that have contributed to that?
Yeah, I think the idea of, Ken Zeichner talks about the third space, conceptually that's appealing, but it does then tend to indicate that this is something taking place in another space other than the school and the university. I think conceptually it's better to think of this as a totally collaborative program that is both within the schools and within the university and across both, rather than this is something in this extra dimension where it happens. But I think the space, it is important that there is some boundary crossing there, that people are having to work within these two sites for beginning teachers learning. And I think that's also the interesting thing, is that looks different if you think about it from the perspective of the learning of the beginning teacher, what they need to learn and what they need to be able to do, not in terms of program structure and administrative arrangements and the mechanics of the partnership. And I think a lot it focuses on that, and that's sort of almost easy. And it's and then you're looking at administrative processes, assessment processes, but I think it's putting the beginning teachers learning at the heart of that helps conceptualize that space.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting, because so often the term third space is bandied about, and actually it almost creates another space. Exactly. Rather than crossing the boundaries.
It's easier to other it,
Yeah, it's easier to think of it in another box and say, well, it's not our fault, so let's put it somewhere else. Yeah. Or it's, well, not necessarily fault, that's not necessarily the right word. So that it's thinking of the student teacher, the beginning teacher, as the space to start the learning for that boundary crossing. Okay, so boundary crossing and Oxford Internship Scheme. How has that worked historically with your partnership schools?
Okay, it's a well-established scheme. It was developed in the 1980s and inaugurated in 1987, and we work with a relatively small number, probably fewer than 40 partnership schools, and it used to be even fewer than that. And I would say that 80% of those schools have been internship schools, partnership schools, since 1987.
Amazing.
So that means that there is, there are lots of teachers mentors, heads of department, senior leaders, head teachers even, several head teachers across the partnership are graduates of the programme. So it does mean that there is that continuity and an understanding and a trust, I think, that can't be developed just overnight. But I think the other thing to say is that, I mean, interestingly, and this sort of blows people's minds, that the scheme was developed as a collaboration between the local authority, with Tim Brickhouse as the Chief Education Officer, the Department of Education at the university, and the schools. And the local authority seconded, I think, 11 teachers for a whole year, to work on this programme with the university. So it wasn't a university model that was then sold to the schools. Everything was co-constructed from the very, very beginning. And it's once that momentum was there, that has generally been sustained, that nothing happens in that programme without the discussion with an agreement of all of our school partners, who will often steer development as much as the university. So that sense of it's collaboratively planned, with either within the subject areas or in relation to the general programme. It's collaboratively delivered and evaluated with equality, parity across the partners.
That's fascinating. Were the priorities back in the 80s of your partners very different to what they are today? Do you know how they've changed over the years? What kind of things are important to schools now in their involvement in initial teacher education?
I think that the schools understand much more about teacher education and the processes of teacher learning. Things were very, very different. I mean, the programme was developed because of, apart from a few exceptions, the pretty dire state of teacher education in England, in the UK, in England at the time, and that there needed to be changed. It was very distant. It was the university, teaching theory and then teaching practice in order exactly to do that, to practice, and a little integration. So this was to turn the whole system on its head. I think the process has been educative for schools, as along with the whole move towards school-based teacher education that's happened in the last decade or so, that, ironically, a lot of the ideas that informed the think tank that then informed, the policy exchange that informed the government agenda were drawn from that work that was done in Oxford about learning teaching from teachers, and Hazel Hagger and Donald McIntyre's work. So school-based teacher education has never been a threat for us. It was just a continuation of what we'd already done. But I think the schools do have a much, much better sense now of what's involved in teacher education and their contribution to that process.
You don't think that they've had a different agenda because of changing policy context in general in education as time has moved on?
Oh, I think definitely. I think some schools have very much gone along that, a Michael Gove-led model of we can do this on our own and we don't need universities, and so this is, we're the best people to train teachers. And but teachers can't be trained without schools, clearly, but it's also, I think we believe that we can add something to that process, but we don't do what the schools do, and we wouldn't expect the schools to do what we do, but the two work together. And as I say, as long as it's collaboratively planned and people understand their roles within that process, I think it works.
So would you say that the principles back in the 80s are the same principles as they are today?
They are exactly the same principles. And I know that because we've had several attempts to look at and redesign the principles. We've had working groups over the years that have involved school colleagues, local authority colleagues, etc. And somehow we come out with the same principles, because I think they were research informed and they were tried and tested, and the schools say to us, why do you want to mess about with these? When they work, we understand them and they work. So actually they are more or less the same principles. Now, one or two of them are a little more challenging than perhaps they were in 1987, but some of the key ones are still there.
Do you mind me asking which ones are more challenging?
Okay, I think the one that says consensus is not to be expected, okay? Because, and the idea of that is that if I'm a student teacher and I have an idea for my classroom and you're my mentor and you have an idea as how I should do that, we can agree to differ, perhaps. It's not that I have to agree with you or you have to agree with me, that sometimes consensus doesn't have to be consensual. It can be that we agree to differ. That's quite hard in the current climate in school to say, no, you go ahead and do it the way you would like to, as long as you've got a strong rationale. We're not saying, oh, just do something because you fancy doing it, but if I have a strong rationale for trying something out, then your school policies and practices may reflect a different perspective.
Yeah.
I think that is a really, really useful source of learning, because we would want our student teachers or interns to be taking into account that school perspective and why they want to do things in a certain way, and balancing up the evidence and drawing up criteria by which to judge what they're doing is effective or not. But the idea that almost consensus is not expected encourages there should be disagreement, and I think some schools find that quite uncomfortable, to have student teachers who it might be seen to be challenging the status quo or the orthodoxy.
Very interesting.
That's probably the one that I think people would say, oh, well, could we just let that one slip?
Yes. And it's interesting to think of how that might be reflective of wider society also. Yes, I think so. Apart from the fact that there's the performativity agenda of the government and schools are under the cosh for that reason, but it's interesting. And about frank and open discussions. Exactly, and being able to have those, and not that somebody's position is being threatened. And that's an opportunity for learning on both sides. Oh, exactly. But I still think we wouldn't get rid of that principle just because it's slightly uncomfortable. And who knows where we might come back round to it, where, where you might want the student teacher to be the one who is the challenging voice within the department. I'm not saying that somebody who is all the time arguing about the way things are done, but as I say, I think as long as every argument is thought through and there's a rationale, and then student teachers are given the opportunity in which to test both perspectives and come to their own conclusions, then I think that would be one of the there are principles around the learning from a diverse range of sources, and then being able to evaluate and critique the evidence and come to decisions about the best ethical decision to take in relation to your own classroom practice, drawing on all the evidence. To make all of that happen, are there quite strong frameworks or directives for what school teacher educators and university-based teacher educators do within the programme of teacher education, or is it relatively loose? I'm just wondering how it's all organised to make these kind of things happen. I suppose the structures help in that the first term is a series of joint weeks when the student teachers are in school, initially 2 and then 3 days per week, and at the university
free, then 2 days. Most of the term is 2 days at the university, 3 days in school. So on the Monday, they will have had some input, some discussions at the university about a particular theme within a subject area. They're in school 3 days, and then they bring the evidence of what they've learnt in school and compare and contrast that with other perspectives, maybe what they've read, what they've heard, theoretical perspectives, their own preconceptions, and what they've heard from the students in school, and have a chance to bring that all into the mix and discuss that with each other and with the tutor on the Friday. So that helps, that structure helps, almost forces that synthesis of different sources. The assignments force them to do that in a way, but that's true of most courses, I would think. The mentors will, most of our mentors will be encouraged to adopt that critical stance with them, so that the meeting with their mentor, the mentor period each week, isn't just about business matters and what's on your timetable. Sometimes that happens, that's inevitable, but that there might be some critical questioning of the interns within that time.
And does it make demands of schools to give the student teachers very particular experience whilst in placement to facilitate that?
Yes, I think so, particularly in the initial stages where the emphasis is primarily on observation rather than it's observing and critiquing, not just sitting through lots of lessons and observing, but observing with a focus to look at specific things, and then gradually introducing them to teaching through perhaps small segments and then whole lessons. Again, that's because one of the principles is a secure learning environment, and that it's a gradual process. It's not in at the deep end. So over the first term, it's all about learning how to, beginning to understand, starting to develop that sort of language is what we're looking for. So I think what they're doing in school reflects that gradual introduction that allows them time to critique.
You said or mentioned that some partnership schools are no longer working with you. Am I right in saying that? I'm trying
to think of one that has been but isn't anymore. I think we've added rather than taken away.
Okay.
What sometimes happens is we have this lovely euphemism that schools may be resting for a year. So they are actually still part of the partnership. They get all the communications, they're invited to all the meetings, but they may be resting. And that's often because of particular localised context issues. That means they don't have the capacity maybe in one particular year to be involved, but several have rested for a year or two and then come back, and I can't think of any that are actually resting at the moment. That I think occasionally I say we add more schools. Sometimes that's for expediency, just because of the number of places that we need to fill. But it's important to say that most of our schools are actually still within the local authority area, with a few just over the half a dozen over the borders into other local authorities. And the reason for that is so that we can run the joint programme in the first term. They have to be able to get to their school and get to the university fairly easily.
Sure. So I'm going to ask a more probing question now. So you said that one of the principles that is perhaps more difficult to accommodate is regarding consensus. That lack of consensus isn't necessarily a negative thing. Within your ways of working, are there any particular challenges that you have identified over the years that the partnership comes up against, where it demands some sort of compromise or rethink on the way that you do things?
Yes, and I think that's becoming increasingly the case, and it's about particular school policies and practices often being determined or directed by the way a multi-academy trust does things, or even it can be an individual school where a particular approach is adopted. So, for example, there's this, is it I do, we do, you do approach, and at the extreme that becomes I will teach you for 15 minutes, we'll talk about it for 15 minutes, and then you've got 30 minutes to work in silence on your own. How do you teach modern languages in that sort of, context? So things like that are challenging. Sometimes it's a matter of negotiating around that and saying, well, look, they are beginning teachers, they've got to try different things, can we have some flexibility within that? And usually that's okay. In some instances it is, well, just make of it, what you can, the best you can. We'll try and find the ways around it, and we will try and find in your second school experience a counter to that, so you have a different sort of context. I'm not trying to say that this is easy, but I think it is becoming increasingly difficult, perhaps in some subjects, in some schools, where there is, for example, so many schools now seem to be delivering the curriculum through booklets, and this bookletization, and that our interns will just be asked to use the resources already there, not to think through necessarily. Planning in a way becomes easy because you don't have to plan much, because you're given the PowerPoint slides, you're sometimes given the script, almost you're given the booklet, and so much is done for you. But I think there are always ways around that, and sometimes it's using it a bit as a Trojan horse, saying that, I know we have to do it this way, but the wretched university is saying that it'd be good if they could have a few weeks when they plan that sort of thing. And,
okay.
There are ways of subverting.
You said that a lot of your partnership schools have been working with you for a long time, and I guess this element of trust in program design, which has been successful, is really, really important. And whilst there are different variations of this within different partnerships across the country, there are probably looser versions of it, or aspects that might reflect that, but not programs that are not designed in that very coordinated way from start to finish. And I'm wondering if you were giving some advice to providers about working in that way that encourages this clinically informed practice, or you might call it practical theorising. What would be your top tips in terms of advice to other providers to foster those relationships with schools, to make that kind of programme design happen effectively?
That's quite hard. I think one is starting with very clear principles and a very clear rationale. I've found that schools are always open to a discussion about ideas, and will engage with ideas, and will be convinced if the ideas are powerful enough and convincing enough. That if you ask any head teacher and say, do you want your teachers to be thinking teachers, they're not going to say no, but that's a good way in, and say, look, we want to encourage the teachers working in your school, even for this year, to be reflective and thinking and about every aspect of their practice. So I think it is starting with the principles. I think it's not trying to put this on as a layer of icing on on the wrong cake, or a cake that's gone a bit stale or just needs retopping, so to speak. You can't. It has to be integral, and I think it has everybody working in the partnership has to have a sense, or the opportunity at least, to have a sense of why this is important, and then not allow it to become, taken as a label with that people then don't think beyond the label. It's like, a while ago everybody would say, oh, I'm a reflective practitioner, and you say, well, what does that actually mean? It's those sorts of things that people understand why this idea of the importance of research and inquiry within the development of teacher professionalism, wider professionalism, is such an important idea and concept. You have to get it, I think. And so that takes some work, but it's not about telling people, it's actually about constructing that and taking into account the context of the school and why might this be difficult in your school context. It's all of those things.
Does promotion of inquiry learning mean something different for a mentor compared to the university-based teacher educator?
I think, in all honesty, it probably does, because, but I'm not saying it will be for all mentors, or that it will be different for all mentors, or it won't for all mentors. Some will think about it in a different way to others. I think the tension is always that, so the criticism that comes from on top, and it's behind the market review, is that mentoring has to improve. There's this deficit view of mentoring. I think it's a misunderstanding of the role of the mentor and the fact that their priority is actually the learning of the pupils, the students in their school, but that those two roles can sit side by side. And I think mentor development is important, but I don't think you do that in a way of giving them 30 hours training. You do it through actually working with mentors, sitting down with them. Within our program, there are at least 4 points in the year where we have 3-way conversations. So we will sit down with the intern, the student teacher, the mentor, and the curriculum tutor, and each person's voice is equal in that discussion, and it will be around the intern's progress, but we'll be looking at the evidence. But that 3-way discussion is a way of engaging mentors in that process. Sometimes modelling, sometimes the mentors are fabulous and they will lead that, and the curriculum tutor has less to say. But the fact that each of those people has sort of an equal role, and the focus is on their progress and their learning, as well as, of course, there has to be an assessment element to it. But again, that's done between the discussion between 3 people. It's not a piece of paper isn't filled in and sent to the university, and the university then quality assures that in some way. It's that sense that we are all working together, and I think that's through that's actually as valuable as mentor development, the opportunity to engage in a process in that way.
And again, that's on this other way of thinking about a third space. With the student teacher at the heart. I'm presuming that most of your student teachers start the course and know what they're getting themselves into in terms of this Oxford internship scheme. But maybe, you're shaking your head. So maybe I was saying I'm presuming, but I'm not presuming, because I was imagining whilst saying I'm presuming that there'll be some that don't know what they're getting themselves into because they don't do their research. And I'm just wondering whether you ever have some students who get into this programme and go, I didn't realise what I was getting into, and find it quite challenging to be on this type of initial teacher education course.
Definitely. Some do get it, some come to realise what the process is, and obviously we talk to them a lot at the beginning about the learning model of the course and their role within that, but it puts a lot of responsibility on them because they have to make sense of everything. It's not us telling them or the schools telling them, they've got to work it out for themselves. But yes, there are those who, unfortunately, the course almost doesn't touch. It does in that, they complete the course successful and, they demonstrate competence in relation to the standards. They produce assignments at a sufficiently high level. But in terms of that learning model and the research-informed clinical practice model, yes, as I say, it almost doesn't touch them. That's not meant as a criticism, it's just the way,
Do you think that's just the nature of human beings, and there's some things appeal to some people and some don't? Or do you think that you could explain that in any kind of way?
I think that you have to accept that, if we're in education, some people are receptive and ready to learn at different stages, and some people who are like that will come back 5 years later and say, now I get it, or, I got into my first school and I realised that I was doing things that some other people weren't doing, and I was thinking in different ways, and I understand now it's all over. So I think it is that some people come with different starting points, and the problem with education is that they all, by the 1st of September, we assume they're all at the same point and that they're going to end at the same point. But of course they all have different starting points. Some will come with more experience, much more experience. I imagine every PGCE course in the country has people who have had experience in the classroom or teaching abroad, or all those sorts of things, or managerial experience, or professional experience elsewhere. So they all have different starting points, so we can't put them all through a sausage machine. And I think that's why, through the research, we've sort of always had a slightly critical view of the notion of staged theory, where, they go through particular phases and it's only towards the later stages, they're concerned firstly with their self, then with pupil behaviour, and then with pupil learning. Yes, for some, a lot of them, that may be the case. You could see, they're very clear. But you don't put them all into those, categories, because then you're not being able to deal with it. They'll get frustrated if that's the case. Some need I think it's about discerning where their needs are at the beginning, the nature of their trajectory. Hugely important are their preconceptions. We spend a lot of time looking at their preconceptions when they begin the course, in order not to say there's a problem with them, but just to understand them, and also to get them to use their preconceptions as one of these important sources of evidence at the beginning, and to interrogate those preconceptions and critique them in a way. And if there are strong rationales for them, then fine, then try those out in your practice. One other thing I didn't say that's I'll pick up now so it doesn't get lost is that in our course the huge focus is on subject, the subject discipline. And although there is a parallel complementary general studies program that looks at the wider aspects of school and schooling, and particularly how that's contextualized within individual schools, so that the interns understand why the policies and practices of a school work in a particular way. There's all of that, but there is a big emphasis on subject. It's not a generic, they're not taught generic approaches to teaching. Everything about pedagogy is contextualized within their own subject discipline. And so I think that adds another dimension.
And perhaps buy-in from the students, because it's something that is part of their own history.
Yeah, exactly. It's. Okay.
I was going to ask about another challenge, and it was in my head, and now it's gone. Yes, I know. So clearly, you've been working at the University of Oxford for a long time, and you're a great advocate of the scheme in spite of challenges which are inevitable. I wonder what kind of evidence you have that this is an effective way for teachers' professional learning. And maybe evidence isn't the right word, I don't know. But how do we know this is a good way to learn to teach, or a very effective route as an entry into the profession, for want of better words?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We evaluate the programme obviously very intensively, but it's always come up highly valued by the interns and by schools when we do ECT surveys in schools. Schools seem to recognise that our graduates come with a particular level of knowledge and skills, understanding and perhaps confidence. It's very difficult to say what evidence, because I would say, well, there's lots of anecdotal evidence, and we can draw on years of the partnership and people, tracking our graduates over time. But then I'm reminded that somebody from the DFE said to me a few years ago, anecdote isn't the plural of evidence, so that's okay, fine. I think there is some international evidence that high quality, high performing systems are ones that are usually characterized by teachers who are engaged certainly with research, if not with and in research, and that research and inquiry approaches are part of the culture of those particular systems. I think there needs to be, that's the problem with the research in teacher education in England. There are very few longitudinal studies that track, beginning teachers learning through their professional careers. I suspect that the current retention crisis, clearly there's a recruitment, there are various other reasons for that, but the retention issue in schools is not unlinked to the fact that a lot of teachers feel less autonomous than they used to, less able to make the decisions about their own practice, less encouraged to engage in, when I say an inquiry approach, I don't mean, they're doing a master's or they're doing an action research project, but as bread and butter a part of their practice, it's a mentality that is, an inquiry-focused approach to everything that they do. So everything that they try out in the classroom, they would be thinking about how they're going to evaluate the effectiveness of that particular approach or whatever. So I think I think the fact that more teachers are leaving is because they don't feel they have that autonomy that they're told how to teach, not allowed to act as a full professional and make those decisions for themselves. That's just...
So, keeping with the theme of autonomy and within teacher education, we've got currently a core content framework from the government, from the Department for Education, on what research and what content should be covered within the initial teacher education programme. How do you respond to the current autonomy of teacher education within this context?
I think I'm going to choose my words carefully. I think it's been very difficult and very challenging. found it probably just as challenging as many other providers have. We feel it threatens university teacher education programs, and looking at our own, we think it's a particular threat. I'm not saying it's more of a threat to us than anywhere else, but we've felt the threat. I think it's reductive, it's prescriptive, I can see why it was felt there was a need to provide a designation of minimum curriculum entitlement. That's not the same as saying that every single provider has to align their programs absolutely rigidly to that set of quality requirements that, I say, are prescriptive. It allows no opportunity to explore alternative ways of doing these things. I think it's ill-conceived. I think it's driven by a particular ideological perspective that a few very privileged people had privilege in terms of determining what this looked like. I don't think there's been yes, there was a consultation, but this was all, the ink was dried before the consultation document was ever written, and there were a few minor changes, but I think it's a threat, and I know that we were very challenged by it. We wouldn't engage with it for a long while, and our position was that we would only be able to deliver a program along these lines in accordance with with our key core principles, and that yes, we could adapt and accommodate, but there would be a point at which we couldn't go beyond that. And I think some things are still very, very challenging. I mean, it's not the intensive training and practice notion per se, because all of our joint work weeks were in effect intensive training and practice weeks. Yeah. Yes, the ITAPs. But the way that they have been now, it has to be a certain number of days, and it has to be done in this way. And the same with the blank requirement, 6 weeks of an 80% teaching. These things like that, there's been no discussion about, and some of these things I think are nonsensical. And I think all things will pass, and
Which leads me really to my final question. Are you optimistic about the future of research-informed teacher education?
I am, yeah, I think so. I think because the power of the ideas will outlive, if I can say it, some of the current nonsense. And I did a keynote at the ISET conference a couple of years ago and I wrote it up with my colleague Catherine Byrne, and it's just been published in Journal of Education for Teaching, and it said, the title is, Does Teacher Education, brackets in England, have a future? And very much teacher education, not teacher training. The teacher training clearly has a future, but actual, research-informed clinical practice teacher education, does it have a future? And I think in the end, it's done as a policy analysis, and what's the problem represented to be, that Carol Bacci work, but it ends optimistically, but I think it's saying that we're at a bit of a crossroads, really, and the future will depend, I think, a lot on which path providers, particularly university providers, choose to take, even given the constraints of the market review. But it's very easy for me to say that, but when university employ dozens, if not hundreds of people on teacher education programs, and there's a risk of those people losing their jobs if you don't get accreditation, then that's all very well me being sort of dewy-eyed about all of this, but when it comes to it, there is a hard reality of that university education departments have to operate and function and survive. But I think I'm really encouraged by the work that we did. Like you and I were involved in that work with USET, the University Council for the Education of Teachers, and that piece of work that we did was published in 2020 called The Intellectual Basis of Teacher Education. I think that position paper is a sort of mini manifesto, and I think if we got behind that and really collectively said this is the type of teacher that we would like to produce, that we value, that would be powerful. And that is about a fully professional, competent, confident professionals who are able to engage with research, critique, be informed by different sources of evidence, be able to research their own practice, all of those things. It's not that everybody has to do an action research project, but that type of teacher who is a rounded professional who can reflect critically on their own practice and the practice of others, I think there's real hope for the future, and we will come through all of. We will come through all of this, and it's
and positively impact the young people who are in our care, and that's what it's about ultimately, isn't it?
Yeah, I would love to see in 5 years' time there's a resurgence that teaching is suddenly again a profession that it's fabulous. We all know because we've all done it. There's nothing quite like it, as a profession, and I just would love there to be like a surge of people coming back into the profession. But
Absolutely.
I think there has to be a lot of things need to change. It's not going to be marketing campaigns or bursaries that causes that to happen. It's got to be a fundamental shift in relation to. I think we need to reclaim teacher professionalism. So that would be my manifesto headline: let's reclaim teacher professionalism.
Fantastic. Trevor, I think that's a great way to end.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you so much for coming to Liverpool John Moores University and engaging in this discussion with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I can't believe it's gone so quickly. Thank you.